Here in eastern North America, we only have one regularly occurring breeding species of hummingbird, the ruby-throated hummingbird. But every fall, as western species are migrating south, some of them get off course and show up in the east, typically found around bird feeders. This is very exciting for eastern birders, and the birds can attract a lot of attention, especially if the species represents a first state or county record, but accessing them isn't always easy. I'm Doug Hitchcox. My goal is to get the most people to see the most birds, and in this video I'm going to talk about the human interaction side of vagrant hummingbirds and some of the issues we deal with in getting access. I'll use a recent occurrence of a rufous hummingbird here in Maine as a case study to talk about what worked, what didn't, and maybe share some of the drama around that. If you're new here, you'll definitely want to watch my Why Birding Needs Gatekeepers video after this, as it goes into more nuance than I can cover here. But let's get started with a little background. There have long been records of western birds showing up as vagrants in the east, particularly through a mechanism called misorientation, but while some of these birds may be lost, some are believed to be prospecting. Rufous hummingbirds have become one of the best examples of this. You can check most field guides, especially if they're 20 or 30 years old, and see that they were considered just a western species, nesting from the Pacific Northwest, western Canada, and into southern Alaska, then wintering into Mexico. They've shown up in the southeast for a long time, but it was around the 1980s that they really increased and even began sticking around. It is easy to understand how desirable, from the bird's perspective, this must be. If you can shave a few hundred miles off your migration and still successfully overwinter, then you've got a head start to get back to your nesting grounds in the spring. Those who occupy the best breeding habitats are going to be the most productive, and then you may pass on those genes that told you to go east. So now rufous hummingbirds are an expected winter resident throughout most of the southeast states, even as far north as Pennsylvania seeing them throughout the winter. It is pretty amazing to see a fairly dramatic range change in a species here in North America in a fairly short time. We are watching many species expand their range northward with climate change, but to see a shift in a wintering area, at least from a portion of the population, is pretty fascinating. Also fascinating is how people rejected the idea of hummingbirds wintering in the east and think that they are doing the right thing by translocating the individual. There are many reports of people, and I should clarify that these are people with permits and permission, catching hummingbirds and either overwintering them in captivity or even flying them all the way to different states. I'll talk more about catching hummingbirds in a bit, but need to point out that we have a ways to go in getting more people to acknowledge that this is a natural phenomenon, and these birds don't need to be saved. Just last month, a ruby-throated hummingbird was caught by rehabbers in Maine to be overwintered indoors. That was in mid-October. Every year we get ruby-throated hummingbirds that linger into October. And we've had November records, and even one that lingered into a Christmas bird count. Anyways, that rant aside, that's it for the background, and maybe this is a good point to just transition to talk about access for birders. Unlike most rare birds that may be found in a park or nature preserve, hummingbirds often come with the challenge of being on private property, specifically in someone's yard. And this is where people like myself come in, and where I'll keep making the case that birders need gatekeepers to help with access. It's through my role as a naturalist with our state's Audubon, or as an eBird reviewer, that I'm often one of the first people to know about a rare hummingbird in the state. I also do a lot of outreach on this. Every fall we'll post a blog, and I'll even write an article for our local newspaper encouraging them to keep their feeders up in the fall. This is the most likely way for us to detect a vagrant hummingbird, and with most people taking their feeders down in September, after all the ruby-throated hummingbirds have left, I know we are missing many of the western species that are coming through. The cool thing is that this has worked. Almost every fall now we have at least one person that gets a hit on their feeder they've kept up. Even my own parents got a rufous hummingbird in 2012. Now, being able to work with a homeowner to get access for more people is the big chore. We've had some really high-profile rare birds in Maine, like the Steller's seagull that drew crowds of hundreds of people to an otherwise quiet town, which I think does a disservice to how non-birders perceive the behavior of birders around rare birds. In most cases, I find that after explaining why the bird is there and how amazing it is, the homeowners actually want to share the experience with people and rarely won't allow anyone at all. Coming up with a set of rules for birders to follow is critical, and I tell this to the homeowners as well. For everyone who wants to see the bird, there isn't anyone who wants to be the one to ruin it for everyone else. The most important things to share, once a homeowner is okay with visitors, is the where, the when, and the how. Where? Unlike other birds that can move all over the landscape, Where you are going to see a hummingbird is pretty obvious, at the hummingbird feeder. So the more important question is, where do the birders go? Being clear on where to park cars and where birders should or shouldn't go is key. We've had some cases where the homeowner was okay with birders standing in their yard all day waiting for a bird to come to a feeder, but the neighbors were especially private, so we really needed to make sure birders were watching property lines and being respectful. The when is interesting. Again, comparing to most rarities, when you can go look from sunup to sundown, homeowners might not want you in their yard first thing in the morning. So finding out what time you can, or importantly can't be there, is a good way to keep access open. Also figuring out if there are certain days people shouldn't go. We had one bird a few years ago where the homeowners didn't want birders going on Sundays because they knew their kids would be outside playing in the yard. And that's an easy rule to follow. And then the how. I'll just lump together the other rules in this and acknowledge that these are the things that will be on a case-by-case basis. We've had homeowners on one end of the spectrum that said anyone could come at any time, and then the other end where they wanted people to individually call them first and arrange a time to visit. And that all worked fine. One thing I tried once, which ultimately didn't end up being necessary, but I'm glad to know it could work, was creating a You Can Book Me account with time slots when the homeowners were okay with visitors coming. They didn't want more than one group coming at a time, so using this automated system for people to pick the time slots seemed like a pretty slick option. And while I could go on from here, the last thing I'll add is that I love encouraging homeowners to put out a guest book and having people sign in when they visit. This is a fun way to connect them with the birders as they get to see how many people have visited, usually where they've come from, and hopefully they get a nice thank you note. Before I talk about the lessons with the recent hummingbird in Maine and maybe some of the drama, I think it'll help to retouch on those people who actually get to touch these birds. A lot of what we've learned about these colonizing hummingbirds is thanks to bird banders, also known as ringers in other countries. Banders are generally ornithologists operating under special permits that allow them to catch birds. Once in the hand, a series of standardized measurements are taken, and the bird is fitted with a federal band that has a unique identifier on it. You could think of it as being the bird's social security number, and if it is ever caught again, that number can be looked up in a database maintained by the USGS. Most individual birds are not going to be visually unique enough to be identified on that individual level, so having a band allows us to keep track of single birds, and then we can learn more about their movements and longevity. Now, fun fact, the oldest known rufous hummingbird was over 8 years old. It was one caught and banded in British Columbia in 1996, and then again in 2004. Banding hummingbirds requires an even more specialized permit, of which only about 150 people in the US have. But their efforts banding these western hummingbirds in the east have been critical to expanding our knowledge. Many of these birds can't be readily identified in the field, and it is only with careful measurements in the hand that we can tell a rufous from an Allen's hummingbird. Maybe if you get a good enough photo of the spread tail, you can see the shape of R2, the second retrix in from the middle, which has a notch in rufous. Or it is fun to hear birders debate the width of R5 from photos, which only varies by a couple millimeters between rufous and Allen's. Aging and sexing the birds can also be done more reliably in the hand, age being best told by looking at the notches that form at the base of the bill. There's a biased thinking that most western vagrants, and I'm talking beyond hummingbirds here, in the east are young males wandering off course. And this does fit the narrative of prospecting birds, be it for winter territory or potentially nesting sites. But we do probably just detect more males because they do typically have a brighter plumage than females. And yeah, lots of vagrants are young birds that probably have some internal compass off, but thanks to hummingbird banders, we know that there are plenty of females and adults that show up here. Speaking of adult female rufous hummingbirds, we just had one in Maine. This was a pretty ideal situation. The homeowner noticed the bird at their feeder, which they admittedly had forgotten was still up, and it was actually empty. But they refilled it immediately and the bird actually came back. Then they went online and found one of my blog posts and reached out. Their photos were pretty poor, only being taken with a cell phone, and I honestly couldn't tell which genus the hummingbird was even in. I couldn't see any buff or rufous on the body, and honestly the small patch of gorget feathers made me really hopeful that this might be Maine's first Annis hummingbird, so I asked if I could go visit and try to get better photos. I wasn't able to go until the next day, and also told a couple birders in the area who had enough experience with hummingbirds that they'd be able to know if it was something exciting or if it was just a late ruby-throated hummingbird. As I mentioned earlier, we do get late ruby throats every year in Maine, including that one that lingered into December. An interesting fact about that bird is that instead of being at a bird feeder, it was found visiting a patch of pineapple sage, a beautiful red salvia that isn't native to Maine, but is common in yards and great for attracting hummingbirds. Interestingly, it is native to Mexico and probably is what that bird would have been foraging on down there at that time of year. Anyways, back to this year's bird. It only made a brief visit and appeared to be a female Celosphorus, probably Rufus as most of them are, but we could still hope that it was Maine's first Allens. I had already contacted Scott Weidensaul, yes, that Scott Weidensaul, who lives nearby in New Hampshire and happens to have a hummingbird banding permit. He has banded several hummingbirds for us in the past and was going to be able to come in 2 days. So Louis Bevier and I went back the next day, and after a couple hours of waiting and taking all the photos and videos we could, trying to capture a photo of that spread tail, Louis finally got a shot showing the notch in R2, and I confirmed it as Rufus. I'll make a quick plug here to make sure you watch my what to do if you find a rare bird video, so you know what to do in a scenario like this. So this is where things get sticky from the gatekeeper perspective. At this point, the homeowner had already allowed other local birders that she was friends with to come over, but my priority was to get the bird banded. This task is much harder and stressful with a crowd there, so we agreed not to make the bird public until Scott banded it. I had notified a couple birders that would probably want to chase it, including one person who was doing a big year, another friend and coworker who was already birding in the area. The latter of who got to see it that first day, along with the locals that I had mentioned. So everything goes great. Scott comes, and despite taking all day, he eventually catches it and bans it. In the meantime, the homeowner has agreed to inviting anyone who wants to make the trek and gives us a great set of rules to follow. I share those rules on the state's rare bird listserv and GroupMe. I set up a stakeout hotspot in eBird for everyone to report from, but unfortunately the bird wasn't seen at all the next day. It is fairly rare for a bird to get scared away from feeders after being banded. It isn't unheard of, but Scott said that it has only happened once in the dozens, or probably hundreds of hummingbirds he's banded now. Once they've found a reliable food source, especially one that they've been coming to for several days, they're unlikely to leave until they've got the fuel reserves needed to make the next jump in their journey. Another good sign this bird was going to stick around was that it was in active wing molt, and most birds don't want to move very far when they're replacing their wing feathers. I'm more suspicious that it was just the presence of people in the yard that kept this skittish bird away from the feeders, but I wasn't there, and I would hope that people were staying far enough away and being quiet. And of course, once the word got out and people tried unsuccessfully, there were plenty of hurt feelings when they saw the eBird reports from those people who got early access while they didn't. So here is the question, and I'd love to hear your opinions in the comments, but what is the proper way to handle this? I stand by our initial attempt to ID this bird and prioritizing getting the bird banded, but should we have erected the highest gate possible and kept everyone else away until then? I thought it was reasonable to get at least a few people in, but suspected that too many would have caused an issue for access and banding. Oh, and if it sways your opinion, the bird did come back. I think only one other birder tried looking beyond that first public day, but the homeowner had been gone for a few days after it was made public, and when they got home they said it was still there, almost like we predicted it would be. To paraphrase the late great Mitch Hedberg, you can't please all the people all the time, and that week all those people were on eBird. Alright, make sure you are subscribed to help me with my goal of getting the most people to see the most birds. Maybe hit that like button, and thank you for watching this video.